Welcome to the world of Cleopatra, where we will explore the entire life of Egypt's final and most famous queen. Now, before our journey begins, I want you to get comfortable. Find your favorite quiet corner, let your shoulders relax, and allow your breathing to slow down. There is no need to rush here. Just let the noise of your day fade completely into the background. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Is it deep evening where you are? Or are you perhaps stealing a quiet moment from a wonderfully chaotic morning on the other side of the world? Whatever the time, if you find comfort in these stories, a simple follow or subscribe helps other weary travelers find our little historical haven. Now, let the present slip away. Imagine yourself not in your room, but in the heart of a vibrant kingdom. We are in Alexandria, a city of scrolls and scholars. Its harbors are filled with ships from distant lands, and its palace is a place of deep intrigue. Here, a young princess watches the world, learning the delicate dance of power she will soon need to survive. In the great palace of Alexandria, silence was a rare and precious thing, something to be hunted. For a girl of 10, it was a game. Cleopatra would slip away from her attendants, her bare feet making no sound on the cool alabaster floors that felt like smoothed river stones, even in the warmest part of the day. The vast corridors were her private kingdom, a world of towering columns painted with lotus flowers and gods with the heads of animals. Most children might have used such spaces for running and shouting, but Cleopatra used them for listening. She learned early that the true business of the kingdom was not conducted in the grand throne room under the watchful eyes of the court, but in the quiet whispers that echoed in the shaded colonnades and behind heavy cedar doors. From behind one such door, she could hear the voices of her older sisters, Berenice and Tryphina. Their arguments were a constant music in the palace, usually sharp and unpleasant. Today, it was about influence. Their father, King Ptolemy, was away on a long journey to the west, to a city called Rome. And in his absence, the sisters circled each other like wary cats. "The commander of the city guard dines with me tonight," Berenice's voice sliced through the wood. A moment of quiet was followed by Tryphina's mocking laugh. "The guards follow the gold, sister, and the keeper of the treasury listens to me." Cleopatra pressed her ear closer to the door, the carved wood rough against her skin. She could almost smell the cloying, heavy lotus perfume her sisters favored, a scent that always seemed to announce their battles before they began. They were not fighting over the kingdom. They were fighting over the pieces of it, unaware that the whole board was being tilted. Her father returned not with the triumphant flourish of a victorious pharaoh, but with the shuffling exhaustion of a man who had sold something he could never buy back. Cleopatra watched from the shadows of a great tapestry as he met with his foreign guests. They were not kings or princes. They wore simple, practical wool garments that seemed plain and dull next to the fine linen and glittering gold of the Egyptian court. Their faces were like stone, impassive and patient, as her father, the great Ptolemy, descendant of Alexander's most trusted general, showed them the kingdom's treasures. He pointed to a small, perfect statue of the god Horus, carved from lapis lazuli with eyes of gold. The men did not admire its beauty. They simply nodded, and a servant carefully packed it into a wooden crate. They were lenders, her tutor had explained, and the king owed them more grain and gold than the Nile could provide in 10 floods. Later, her father sat alone, not on his throne, but on a simple stool, holding a flute to his lips. He played a soft, mournful tune that drifted through the halls, a sound so full of sorrow it made Cleopatra's chest ache. The court had given him a new name behind his back, Olates, the flute player. They meant it as an insult, a king who preferred music to ruling. But as she watched him, his shoulders slumped. Cleopatra did not see a weak musician. She saw a man trying to find a melody in a world that had fallen silent, a king who had journeyed to the city of wolves and returned with their scent on his clothes and their debt fastened around his neck like a collar of iron. Her tutor, a Greek scholar with kind eyes and a beard that was more gray than black, found her hiding behind the tapestry. He did not scold her for spying. Instead, he knelt beside her, his voice as soft as the rustle of papyrus. "Do you see, princess?" he murmured, pointing not to her father, but towards the window that looked out over the great harbor. "Our world has always been fed by the Nile. It flows from the heart of the land, bringing life north to the sea. It is a gift from the gods." He paused, then looked at the crates being loaded onto a broad-beamed Roman ship. But the wealth of Egypt, our gold, our grain, even our gods, it now flows west. It is like a river flowing in reverse, a thing that should not be. Cleopatra understood the meaning, if not the mechanics of it all. She saw the impassive faces of the Romans, the desperate exhaustion on her father's face, and the pointless squabbling of her sisters. Her sisters fought for control of the palace guards and the treasury keys, believing that was the source of authority. But these quiet men in their plain wool clothing held the real power. They did not need to shout or scheme. They simply waited, and the treasures of 1,000 years were brought to them. She thought of their stillness, their lack of outward emotion, and a cold understanding settled within her. This lesson became her secret. While Berenice and Tryphena practiced their smiles for the court and schemed for favor, Cleopatra began to spend her time with her tutor. He taught her the languages of the men in wool, of the traders from Syria, and of the dark-skinned soldiers from Nubia who guarded her family. If whispers were the true currency of power, she decided she would learn to understand every whisper in every tongue. She would not be like her sisters, who could only hear the arguments they started themselves. She would listen to the entire world. One evening, she asked her tutor why the Romans were so powerful. He did not speak of armies or gold. He took her to a balcony overlooking the city. Below, the lamps of Alexandria glittered like a fallen constellation, a testament to Greek ingenuity and Egyptian wealth. "They are not cleverer than we are," the old scholar said, his gaze distant, "and their city is not more beautiful. But they are united. They think of themselves as one thing, Rome. We," he gestured to the palace around them, "think of ourselves as a collection of ambitions. Your sisters, the priests, the generals, everyone pulls the thread for themselves, and they wonder why the tapestry is unraveling. He was right. She had seen it in the way her sister's attendants were loyal only to their mistress, not to the royal house. She saw it in the way the priests argued with the generals over funding for temples versus armies. Everyone was fighting to be the most important person in a house that was slowly sinking into the sand. The men in wool did not seem to fight amongst themselves. They moved as one, with one purpose, and that purpose was to collect what they were owed. Cleopatra stood on the balcony long after her tutor had left, the night air cool on her skin. She heard the distant sound of her father's flute, a lonely thread of music weaving through the immense and silent palace. It was a beautiful sound, but it was the song of an ending. She knew then, with a certainty that was far beyond her years, that she would have to learn a different kind of music. It would not be a song of sorrow. It would be a song of negotiation, of strategy, a melody sharp enough and complex enough to be heard even in the cold stone halls of Rome. Around the sprawling palace complex, the familiar sounds of city life, the calls of night watchmen, and the gentle lapping of the sea in the harbor continued their ancient, unceasing rhythm. The bitter arguments that echoed through the palace halls began to fade for the young Cleopatra. Those sounds were replaced by a profound and welcome quiet as she grew older, for she had found a sanctuary far more powerful than any throne room. While her sisters, Berenice and Tryphena, continued their endless dance of courtly plots, vying for the favor of men her father brought from Rome, Cleopatra chose a different path. She turned away from the heavy lotus perfumes and whispered insults, finding her strength not in alliances of marriage or influence, but within the cool stone walls of the museum. It was a place of learning, connected to the great library of Alexandria, and here, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, she began to build a kingdom within her own mind, one that no rival could ever conquer. This new world was one of endless corridors lined with wooden shelves, each one groaning under the weight of countless papyrus scrolls. The scent in these halls was not of flowers or incense, but of something far more enduring, the dry, almost sweet perfume of aging paper and dried ink. To Cleopatra, it was the smell of history itself. She would run her fingers over the clay tags that identified each scroll, reading names from generations past: Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles. Each roll she carefully lifted felt heavier than its meager weight, burdened as it was with the thoughts and dreams of people long dead. While others saw power in gold, she was beginning to understand that true, lasting power was held here, in these silent, sleeping words, waiting for a mind sharp enough to awaken them. Her tutor, a quiet philosopher named Philostratus, recognized the fire in her almost immediately. He watched as she moved from mathematics to medicine, from astronomy to literature, not as a princess performing a duty, but as a hungry mind seeking nourishment. Unlike her siblings, she did not merely learn, she consumed knowledge. Philostratus guided her, setting before her the histories of great empires, the Persians, the Athenians, and the ever-present, ever-growing Republic of Rome. He saw how she paid closest attention to the stories of their rise, and, more importantly, the reasons for their fall. It was during these lessons that the quiet scratching of reed pens on fresh papyrus would fill the room, a sound of creation that stood in stark contrast to the destructive plotting that defined the rest of the palace. It was Philostratus who insisted she moved beyond the Greek of her ancestors and the classical Egyptian used in the temples. A ruler cannot command the loyalty of a people whose words she does not understand, he told her, his voice gentle but firm. And so she applied her relentless focus to the languages of her world. She sat with merchants from Syria, her brow furrowed in concentration as she learned the sharp, clipped sounds of their Aramaic tongue. She practiced the dialects of the desert tribes with her own guards, and learned the deep, resonant language of the Nubian commanders who oversaw the kingdom's southern borders. Her command of these languages became more than a skill. It was a tool, a key that unlocked the hearts and minds of those she would one day need to lead. One afternoon, a lumber merchant from Tyre arrived at the palace, expecting to haggle through a chain of interpreters for a shipment of cedar wood vital for the Egyptian fleet. He was ushered into a simple study where the young princess sat alone. She greeted him in his own dialect, her accent nearly perfect, and began to negotiate the price of the lumber with a calm authority that startled him. She discussed the quality of the wood, the dangers of the sea routes, and the value of his cargo with the knowledge of a seasoned trader. The man, accustomed to dealing with distracted officials, found himself so impressed by her command of his language and his business that he granted her a price far better than any interpreter could have secured. This was a new kind of power, one wielded not with threats, but with understanding.
As the years passed, Cleopatra's education expanded beyond scrolls and languages. Philostratus arranged for her to meet with retired generals who had served her father. With them, she did not discuss battles of the past, but wars of the future. She would spread out maps on a great stone table, her finger tracing the coastlines and the mountain passes, and debate strategies with them. She learned how a single well-placed garrison could secure a trade route, and how the loyalty of a naval fleet depended entirely on steady pay and full grain stores. The old soldiers, at first amused by the young royal's interest, soon found themselves engaged in serious discussions, challenged by her sharp questions and her uncanny ability to see weaknesses in their plans. She also sought out the economists and merchants who managed the true lifeblood of Egypt, its wealth. From them, she learned about the flow of grain down the Nile and across the Great Sea, the intricate systems of taxation, and the delicate balance of trade that kept Alexandria the richest city in the world. They spoke of the endless demand for Egyptian wheat in Rome, a demand that gave her kingdom a strange and precarious power over the city of wolves. She listened intently, absorbing the complex realities of supply and debt. She came to see the kingdom not as a map of cities and temples, but as a living body, with arteries of trade and a heart that beat with the rhythm of the annual flood. Philostratus watched all of this with a mixture of immense pride and deep, gnawing fear. He saw in her the intellect of a great scholar, the charm of a skilled diplomat, and the cold, practical mind of a general. She was everything the Ptolemaic Dynasty needed to survive, a perfect synthesis of Greek reason and Egyptian tradition. Yet he could not shake a sense of dread. He would watch her as she stood by a high window, the bright African light casting long shadows across the floor, and wonder if it would be enough. He had armed her with all the wisdom of the ages, with knowledge gathered from countless scrolls and a dozen different cultures. He often wondered, was knowledge truly power when faced with brute force? Could the cleverest words and the most brilliant strategies stand against the relentless march of 10,000 Roman legionaries? Rome was a storm gathering on the horizon, a force that did not debate philosophy, but imposed its will with iron and steel. He had given her a shield forged of wisdom, but he feared the sword that was coming was one it could not possibly deflect. The world was changing, and he felt as though he were preparing the last true pharaoh for a future that might have no room for pharaohs at all. This uncertainty was a constant, unspoken presence in their lessons. As Cleopatra grew into a young woman, she too became aware of it. She could feel the weight of her ancestors, the burden of a kingdom that had endured for thousands of years, now resting squarely on her shoulders. The endless shelves of the library no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like a repository of ghosts whispering warnings and expectations. The quiet scratching of the reed pen on papyrus, once a comforting sound, now seemed to be counting down the moments until she would be forced to leave this world of thought and enter the world of action, where a single mistake could unravel everything. The scent of the old scrolls lingered as she reflected on all that she had learned and all that was yet to come. Lucius Vorenus, a centurion hardened by a decade of campaigns, shifted his weight from one worn sandal to the other, the movement causing his leather armor to groan in a familiar way. For weeks, the only sound had been the rhythmic splash of oars and the snap of canvas in the wind. Now, a new sound rolled across the water, the low hum of a great city. He lifted a hand to shield his eyes, not from a harsh glare, but from the sheer brightness of the place. Ahead, Alexandria spread along the coast, a line of white marble and gold that seemed to mock the disciplined austerity of their Roman worships. Above it all, a tower of impossible height pierced the sky, its polished mirrors catching the light and sending a brilliant spark across the waves. Lucius had heard tales of the Pharos, the great lighthouse, but the stories had failed to capture its immensity. It was less a building and more a statement, a declaration of wealth and power that felt ancient and utterly alien.
As their vessel drew closer, the clean scent of the open sea was replaced by a complicated mix of smells from the shore, sweet perfumes, the sharp tang of unfamiliar spices, roasting meat, and something else, the scent of countless people living closely together. The groaning of their own ship's timbers was soon lost in the noise of the harbor. Hundreds of vessels, from sleek Egyptian pleasure barges with purple sails, to broad-bellied merchant ships from Syria and beyond, crowded the docks. Lucius watched as dock workers, their skin darker than any he had seen in Gaul or Britannia, shouted to one another in a dozen languages he could not place. His men stood silently at the rails, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. They were conquerors of half the world, yet here They felt like provincials visiting the capital for the first time. This city did not feel like a place to be conquered. It felt like a place that swallowed armies whole. The order to make ready came down the line, and Lucius moved with the practiced efficiency of a career soldier. He checked the alignment of his cohort, the polish on their helmets, the straightness of their red-plumed crests. Their general, Julius Caesar, was a man who noticed every detail, and his arrival in Egypt was not a social call. They were here because a civil war had spilled its bloody aftermath onto these foreign shores. Caesar's rival, Pompey the Great, had fled here, seeking refuge after his defeat. Lucius had fought against Pompey's legions, but he respected the man. A Roman was a Roman, and their quarrels were their own. As they prepared to disembark, a delegation of Egyptians approached, their fine white linen robes a stark contrast to the Romans' heavy wool and metal. They moved with a languid grace, as if they had all the time in the world. Slow, Lucius stood in the honor guard, just behind Caesar, as the Egyptians, led by a smooth-faced man with cunning eyes, made their formal greetings. The man, a court official named Pothinus, spoke through a translator, his words full of welcome and flattery. He spoke of the eternal friendship between Egypt and Rome, and of a gift they had prepared to show their loyalty to Caesar. Lucius felt a prickle of unease. He had seen many defeated men offer gifts, and they were usually desperate, clumsy affairs. These Egyptians were too confident, too pleased with themselves. Pothinus gestured, and a servant brought forward a large woven basket. For a moment, Lucius thought it might contain jewels or gold, the usual currency of diplomacy. The air was still, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the stone quay. The servant dramatically unveiled the basket's contents. There, resting on a bed of leaves, was a human head. The features were gray and slack, but unmistakable. It was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, a man who had been consul of Rome, a man who had been Caesar's ally and son-in-law before becoming his most bitter enemy. A collective gasp went through the Roman ranks. Lucius felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was not a gift. It was an obscenity. He and his men had spent years fighting this man, chasing him across the world. But to see him reduced to this, it was a violation of every Roman principle of honor, even in enmity. He dared a glance at Caesar, expecting to see triumph, or at least grim satisfaction. What he saw on his general's face was something far more terrifying. There was no joy, there was no relief. For a fleeting second, Caesar's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in something that looked like profound sorrow. Then, his features settled into a mask of cold, controlled fury. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and his gaze on Pothinus became as hard and unforgiving as granite. The Egyptian official, still smiling, seemed to miss it entirely. He clearly expected praise for eliminating Caesar's rival, for solving his problem. The fool. Lucius knew his general. Caesar was a predator, and he honored other predators. Pompey had been a worthy adversary.
To have him butchered like an animal by these palace schemers was not a favor. It was the deepest of insults.
Pothinus continued to speak, explaining how they had done this for Caesar. But the words were lost to Lucius. He was watching a scene he knew he would never forget. The smiling Egyptian, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed, and the silent Roman general, whose quiet rage was more dangerous than any legion. In that moment, the immense lighthouse, the golden palaces, and the ancient power of this city all seemed to fade away. Lucius realized with chilling clarity that these people had no idea what kind of man they were dealing with. They understood wealth and intrigue, but they did not understand Rome. They did not understand the intricate dance of power, ambition, and honor that defined men like Caesar. Their single act of misjudgment had changed everything. They thought they were closing a chapter of Roman civil war, but they had just invited the wolf into their own sheepfold. Caesar had arrived in pursuit of an enemy. Now he had a reason to stay. He had a wrong to avenge, not for Pompey's sake, but for the sake of Roman dignity, which these people had so casually trampled. The local politics were a mystery to Lucius. He knew only that there was a boy king and his sister, the queen named Cleopatra, who were rivals for the throne. He wondered if this queen, wherever she was, understood the gravity of the mistake her brother's court had just made. The Egyptian delegation finally withdrew, still seemingly pleased with their day's work. Caesar remained silent for a long time, staring not at the city, but out at the sea, as if looking back toward a Rome that now seemed very far away. He then turned, his face unreadable, and began issuing quiet, precise orders. They were not the orders of a guest. They were the orders of a man taking control. Lucius gripped the hilt of his gladius, the familiar leather cool against his palm. The heat of this foreign land pressed in on him, making the sweat trickle under his helmet. The sun began to set, casting long shadows from the masts in the harbor, and the great lighthouse began to prepare its nightly vigil. Lucius stood his post on the dock, the sounds of the alien city washing over him. He heard music from a nearby tavern, the cry of a merchant selling his wares, the distant sound of a woman laughing. It was a city teeming with life, unaware that its fate had just been sealed by a single gruesome offering in a basket. His fellow soldiers were quiet, their usual rough jokes and complaints absent. They too had felt the shift. They had arrived as visitors, but they would not be leaving as such. In these quiet moments on the waterfront, surrounded by the murmur of a foreign tongue, Lucius could almost forget the weight of the civil war that had brought them to this strange and ancient shore. He could almost forget the years of marching, the battles, the friends lost. But then he would remember the look on Caesar's face, a look of cold purpose,
and he knew that their work here had only just begun. The uninvited guests had been given the keys to the house, and they would not be returning them. Demetrios, the grain merchant, had known the rhythm of Alexandria his entire life. It was a rhythm set by the clatter of cartwheels on stone, the calls of sailors from the great harbor, and the steady, comforting aroma of fresh bread baking in the clay ovens near his stall. But that rhythm was now broken, replaced by a jarring, uneven beat. He found himself pausing, his hand deep in a sack of barley, whenever the heavy, rhythmic tramp of Roman sandals passed by. Conversations in the marketplace, once a lively flow of gossip and haggling, would drop to cautious whispers until the patrol was out of sight. The city felt like a body holding its breath, waiting for a fever to break. This tension had a source everyone understood, but few dared to name aloud. The city was a house divided against itself. Forces loyal to the boy king, Ptolemy, and his powerful advisors controlled the city guard, their polished bronze helmets a familiar sight. Yet, within the walls of the royal palace district, the foreign general, Caesar, and his disciplined legions held sway. Demetrius watched a group of local guardsmen stare with open hostility at a Roman centurion inspecting the quality of fruit at a nearby stall. It was a silent challenge, a promise of violence that made the simple act of selling grain feel like a dangerous occupation. Because of this, his daily earnings had dwindled, and the worry for his family's next meal was a constant, heavy knot in his stomach. That worry sharpened into outright fear when the shouting began. It started near the canopic gate, a low rumble that grew into a roar. People began to run, overturning stalls and scattering livestock. Demetrios moved with the practiced speed of someone who knew the value of his goods, dragging his heavy grain sacks to form a barrier in front of his small stall. A moment later, the street was a chaotic surge of bodies as the king's supporters clashed with a Roman patrol. The harsh mix of sounds, clanging metal, splintering wood, and angry screams assaulted his ears. From a crack in his makeshift wall, he saw stones fly and swords drawn. The sharp, unpleasant smell of smoke from an overturned brazier made his eyes water, and he pressed his face into the rough, woven texture of a grain sack, praying the tide of violence would pass him by. After the chaos receded, leaving behind a street littered with debris and fear, a different kind of currency began to trade in the marketplace. While sweeping spilled wheat from the dusty ground, Demetrios listened. He heard whispers that the true queen, Cleopatra, the king's older sister, was not in the city at all. Some said she was raising an army of her own near the eastern frontier, a rebel in the desert. Others claimed she had fled south, up the Nile, seeking the loyalty of the old country priests. To Demetrios, these were just stories, tales told to make sense of a world that no longer did. He wondered if any of them could be true, or if she was simply gone, another royal name lost to the brutal games of power that always seemed to crush the common people beneath them.
As the day ended, the setting sun cast long shadows that seemed to deepen the city's gloom. Demetrios packed his remaining goods, his movements slow and tired. He gazed towards the harbor, where the colossal Pharos lighthouse was beginning its nightly vigil. The Roman warships sat like dark, silent predators on the water, their presence a constant reminder of who held the real power in this fight. The usual evening bustle was gone, replaced by an uneasy quiet. People hurried home, their eyes downcast, avoiding the gaze of the soldiers who now patrolled every corner. It was a city under occupation, not just by a foreign army, but by its own internal conflict. It was in this weary quiet that he noticed the small fishing boat. It slipped into a minor dock, far from the grand moorings of the trade ships, its movements furtive and quick. Demetrios watched with little interest as two men disembarked, carrying a long, heavy object between them. It was a carpet, rolled and bound tightly with rope. They struggled with its weight as they carried it off the docks and turned towards the palace district, the very area Caesar now commanded. He gave it a passing thought. Perhaps it was a rich tribute, a desperate gift to the Roman to win his favor. In a city of immense wealth and strange dealings, it was not an altogether unusual sight, and he soon dismissed it and headed for home. The next morning, however, the air in the marketplace was different. The fearful silence had been replaced by a frantic, excited buzzing. The whispers were no longer about armies in the desert. They were about a single audacious act. Demetrios first heard the full tale from a fisherman who swore he saw it himself. The story was so incredible he laughed. But then he heard it again from a woman who worked in the palace kitchens, her voice filled with awe. The rumor spread faster than any fire. The carpet he had seen the night before, the one carried so carefully into the Romans' quarters, had not been a simple gift. It was a vessel. The full weight of the act settled upon Demetrios as he stood by his stall, the familiar feel of grain running through his fingers. He pictured it clearly now, the small boat, the heavy roll, the journey past her brother's sentries and into the heart of her enemy's camp. The whispers solidified into a shout that echoed through the city. Queen Cleopatra had unrolled herself at Caesar's feet, appearing from nowhere like a goddess from a legend. This was not a monarch who waited for destiny to be handed to her. This was a ruler who rolled herself up in a rug and had herself delivered to it. A slow smile spread across Demetrios's face, the first genuine one in weeks. He looked out at the city, at the Roman soldiers and the tense faces of his fellow merchants. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The struggle was no longer just between a boy king's council and a foreign general. A new force had entered the contest, not with an army, but with an act of impossible courage. The city was still a dangerous place, the future a terrifying unknown, but it was no longer without a flicker of possibility. The audacity of a single woman had woven itself so completely into the spirit of Alexandria, offering a fragile, defiant strand of hope. With Caesar's legions securing the city, a fragile peace settled over Alexandria, allowing Queen Cleopatra to finally claim the throne that had been denied her. The civil war was over,
and her brother husband was gone, swallowed by the very Nile he had sought to control. For Pasherenptah, an old priest who had served her father, this victory felt both triumphant and deeply unsettling. He stood now on the bustling docks, the familiar scent of river water and damp earth, a constant in a world that had become unpredictable. He watched as servants and artisans put the finishing touches on a vessel so grand it dwarfed the Roman warships still anchored in the harbor. This was to be a journey of consolidation, a procession down the great river to show the people that their true ruler was restored.
From his vantage point, Pasherenptah saw how two worlds were being woven together on that magnificent royal barge. The hull was carved with the protective eyes of Horus, and its great sail bore the sun disk of Ra, ancient symbols meant to reassure the people of the god's favor. Yet, atop the mast, a gilded eagle, the symbol of Rome, seemed to preen in the bright light. Its wings spread wide over the sacred emblems of Egypt. This juxtaposition sent a tremor of unease through the old priest's heart. He had spent a lifetime studying the proper order of things, the delicate balance between the divine and the mortal, and this felt like a violation. It was a partnership of necessity, he told himself, a clever move by a queen who had outmaneuvered all her enemies. Still, the sight of Roman centurions, their disciplined armor, a stark contrast to the white linen kilts of the Egyptian guards, made him question who was truly serving whom. When the queen finally appeared, a collective gasp rippled through the assembled nobility. She was not merely a monarch, she was a vision, adorned in the flowing robes of Isis, the great mother goddess. A diadem shaped like the sun disk, held between two horns, sat upon her dark hair, proclaiming her divinity to all who looked upon her. Pasherenptah felt a swell of profound pride. This was the pharaoh Egypt needed, a living link to the gods. But then, beside her, walked the Roman, Julius Caesar. He wore no crown, only a simple purple-bordered toga over his military tunic. His face was weathered, his gaze direct and assessing, taking in the crowd, the ship, the sky, as if calculating their strategic value. They stood together, the goddess and the general, and Pasherenptah saw them not as lovers, but as two powerful currents merging into a single formidable river, one that could either nourish the land or carve a new destructive path through it. The journey down the Nile became a spectacle of calculated brilliance. At every town and village, the barge would draw near the shore, and Cleopatra would appear before the cheering crowds. She spoke to them in their own tongue, her voice carrying across the water, reminding them of the ancient promises of prosperity tied to the river's flood and the pharaoh's grace. People threw lotus blossoms onto the water, their offerings floating in the vessel's wake. They saw their goddess queen, and their faith was renewed. Pasherenptah, observing from the deck, felt his own anxieties ease with each adoring cheer. Perhaps she had it all under control. But in the quieter moments, he would see her walking the deck with Caesar, their heads close together, gesturing not towards the temples on the shore, but towards the fertile fields, the quarries, and the trade routes. Their conversation was not of gods, but of logistics. During the long, warm evenings, the royal barge transformed into a floating palace of celebration. Musicians played soft melodies on lutes and harps, and the air carried the aroma of roasting duck and honeyed cakes. At a grand banquet, Pasherenptah found himself seated near the royal dais. He savored the familiar taste of sweet, sticky dates and sipped a tart wine from the northern vineyards, feeling a measure of comfort in these timeless traditions. The queen, having shed the heavy regalia of Isis, wore a fine Greek-style gown of sheer linen. She was laughing, engaged in a lively conversation with Caesar. But the language she spoke was not Egyptian, nor was it the Greek of the court. It was the harsh, rhythmic cadence of Latin, the language of command and conquest. Pasherenptah could only catch a few words, but he recognized them: legion, grain, tribute, alliance. He watched, fascinated and horrified, as she argued a point, her hands moving with the same authority she used to bless her people. Caesar listened intently, occasionally smiling, sometimes shaking his head, but always with a look of deep respect. This was not a subordinate monarch pleading with her overlord. This was a negotiation between equals. The priest felt a profound sense of dislocation. The woman who could embody a goddess in the morning sun could, by torchlight, debate Roman military tactics and economic policy with the most powerful man in the world. He had always believed Egypt's strength came from its eternal traditions and the favor of the gods. Now he was forced to wonder if its survival depended on mastering the ways of its new friends, who might one day become its masters.
The further they traveled from the worldly noise of Alexandria and deeper into the timeless heart of Egypt, the more the priest's internal conflict grew. He saw how Cleopatra charmed the Roman officers, not just with her beauty, but with her intellect, discussing their own histories and heroes with a knowledge that clearly surprised them. She showed Caesar the great temples at Thebes, explaining the stories carved into the stone walls, translating the ancient hieroglyphs herself. It was a masterful display, reminding the Roman that his own city was but a provincial upstart compared to a civilization that measured its history in thousands of years. Yet, for every step she took to assert Egypt's ancient grandeur, she took another to bind it closer to Rome, promising its vast wealth and grain to fuel Caesar's ambitions. This careful balancing act left Pasherenptah deeply torn. On one hand, she was securing Egypt's future, using this foreign power as a shield against all other threats. She had brought peace and stability where her father and siblings had only brought chaos and debt. The granaries were full again, and the people along the riverbank were content. On the other hand, he feared she was teaching the Roman eagle how to hunt in their lands. By revealing Egypt's strengths, its endless food supply, its strategic position, its deep coffers, she was also revealing its vulnerabilities. What was now an alliance of convenience could easily become a relationship of dependency and eventually one of subjugation. The Romans were practical men, and he knew they did not give their friendship for free. He began to see the two currents not just in the queen and the general, but within the queen herself.
One was the current of the Nile, ancient and divine, tied to the gods and the black, fertile earth. This was the Isis who blessed her people. The other was the current of the Tiber, pragmatic and relentless, flowing with the power of legions and the cold logic of empire. This was the negotiator who spoke Latin in the night. Pasherenptah prayed to the gods of his ancestors that she could keep these two powerful forces in balance, that the Nile would not be diverted to fill Roman canals. He worried that in her effort to ride both currents at once, she might be swept away by the stronger of the two.
As the journey neared its end, the great barge, turning back towards the northern delta, the priest felt a weary resignation settle over him. He had seen a queen who was more clever, more capable, and more daring than any pharaoh in living memory. She was Egypt's greatest hope, and, he feared, its greatest gamble. He had no answers, only questions that circled in his mind like vultures over a battlefield. Was this the dawn of a new, stronger Egypt, allied with the world's rising power? Or was it the beginning of a beautiful, slow sunset, the last golden rays of a kingdom that had shone for 3,000 years? As he prepared for rest in his small cabin, the gentle lapping of the river against the hull provided its usual ancient rhythm, a sound that had soothed generations. But tonight it seemed quieter, almost lost beneath the faint, distant call of a Roman horn practicing its evening drills. Livia felt the familiar, jarring pressure of the city's cobblestones through the thin leather of her sandals. Each stone was a small, hard truth, a reminder of the unyielding nature of Rome. Unlike the smooth, polished floors of the city's great villas, the streets belonged to everyone, and they were as uneven and worn as the Republic itself. She adjusted the simple woolen palla covering her head, her fingers tracing the modest border. Simplicity was a virtue, a strength. It was the Roman way. Her son, Decimus, a junior senator with more ambition in his heart than years on his face, walked beside her. He had the same serious set to his jaw as his father, a man who had died for the Republic on a dusty field in Gaul. This sense of tradition was precisely why the news Decimus carried felt so unsettling. "She is here," he had said that morning, his voice low, as if the words themselves were a betrayal. "Caesar has brought his Egyptian queen to the city." Now they stood among the thousands crammed into the forum, a sea of white togas and colored tunics. Livia felt a bead of sweat trace a path down her temple, the press of so many bodies making the air stagnant and difficult to breathe. The sheer noise was a physical force, a constant roar of conversation, vendors' calls, and the shuffling of countless feet. It was the sound of Rome's heart, a sound she had always loved. Today, it sounded like a warning.
Then, the character of the noise changed. A hush fell over one section of the crowd, a wave of silence that spread until a new sound took its place, the high, strange melody of flutes playing a tune that did not belong among these hills. Livia saw it then. It was not a procession for a triumphant general celebrating a victory for Rome.
This was something else entirely. A group of dark-skinned men in white linen kilts, their heads shaved, cleared the way. They were followed by women scattering flower petals that were not Roman roses or violets, but exotic blue lotuses. The scent of them, sweet and heavy, reached Livia, and she felt a tightness in her chest. It was the perfume of a foreign world, a world of gods with animal heads and kings who were themselves called gods. The queen herself was not walking. She was carried aloft in a covered chair, a gilded box of ivory and cedar, borne on the shoulders of 8 towering Nubian guards. The curtains were partly drawn, but Livia caught a glimpse of a pale arm adorned with gold bracelets shaped like coiling snakes. The display was breathtaking in its arrogance. Romans honored their leaders with statues of marble and bronze, figures of stern duty. This moving throne, this deliberate separation from the common ground, was an assertion not of leadership, but of divinity. It was a spectacle designed to awe, but to Livia, it felt like an insult to the very ground on which it was carried. She glanced at Decimus and saw his jaw was clenched, his knuckles white where he gripped the folds of his toga. That evening, the oppressive feeling of the day followed them home. Their villa, usually a sanctuary of quiet order, felt tense. They say Caesar has installed her in his own villa across the Tiber, Decimus said, pacing the cool tiles of the atrium. He did not look at his mother, but at the bust of his father in its niche. He lavishes her with gifts, hosts banquets in her honor that last until dawn. The elders, they are worried. Cicero speaks of it in hushed tones. Brutus says nothing, but his silence is heavier than any speech. He finally stopped and faced her. Mother, they say, she has given him a son. Livia felt a cold dread settle deep within her. It was not the child that mattered. It was the meaning of the child. A son to Caesar, born of a foreign queen. Romans had heirs, but kings had dynasties. The whispers Decimus brought home from the Curia, the great meeting hall of the Senate, were becoming more fearful. Men who had fought beside Caesar, who had celebrated his victories, now looked at him with suspicion. They spoke of his ambition not as a servant of the state, but as its potential master. This queen, with her exotic court and her son, was not just a guest. She was a symbol of a future that felt profoundly un-Roman, a future where the Senate answered to one man, and that man answered to the whims of a woman who believed herself a goddess. The final, unforgivable act came not with a procession, but with a quiet dedication. A friend, returning from the new temple Caesar had built to honor his ancestor, Venus, told Livia what she had seen. Her voice was a shocked whisper. Inside, among the gods of Rome, he has placed a golden statue. It is her, Livia, the Egyptian, depicted as Isis, with the boy Caesarion in her arms. Livia felt the blood drain from her face. It was one thing to host a foreign monarch. It was another entirely to elevate her to the level of their most sacred deities. To place her image in a holy space meant to honor the divine mother of the Roman people.
This act solidified the fears into a hard, brittle certainty. Caesar, the man who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon, was no longer just a Roman. He had been enchanted, bewitched by an Eastern power that did not understand the quiet dignity of the Republic. The foreign queen had not conquered Rome with armies, but with something far more insidious. She had offered a man who already had everything, the one thing the Republic forbade: a crown. The conversations in the homes of senators grew shorter, the glances exchanged in the forum more meaningful. A storm was gathering, and its heart was not in the sky, but in the hearts of men who felt their world slipping away.
The news of Caesar's death arrived like a physical blow. A frantic servant burst into the villa, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. He spoke of daggers in the Senate House, of chaos erupting at the feet of Pompey's statue. Decimus rushed home soon after, his face pale, his white toga stained with a splash of crimson that was not his own. He did not speak of victory or liberation. He spoke of the terrifying silence that followed the frantic act, the confusion as the assassins stood over the body, unsure of what came next. There was a grim sense of order restored, a feeling that a great sickness had been cut from the body of the state. Yet, as the initial shock subsided, a new and deeper fear took its place. The city did not celebrate. The streets grew quiet. Doors were barred. The people did not hail the assassins as saviors. They hid, waiting to see which way the winds of power would now blow. Livia stood on her balcony, looking over the rooftops of a city holding its breath. The foreign queen had been a symbol of everything they feared Caesar was becoming, a living embodiment of the lure of absolute power. They had removed the man, but had they removed the ambition he represented, wondered? The queen was still across the river, a viper they had allowed into their home, and now her protector was gone. The chaos Caesar's death was meant to prevent now seemed inevitable. The city felt fragile, the peace of generations balanced on a knife's edge. The affair with the foreign queen had left its stain on the very soul of Rome, and now the city waited in grim silence for the coming storm. The hard, uneven cobblestones outside seemed to promise a difficult path ahead, a future that would be paid for with Roman blood.
Mark Antony stood on the quay at Tarsus, the rough wool of his military tunic a familiar comfort against his skin. He was a man accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed, a ruler of the eastern half of the Roman world. He had summoned the Queen of Egypt to this port city to answer for her loyalties, or lack thereof, in the recent wars. He expected a vassal, perhaps a nervous one, arriving to plead her case before a man who held the fate of her kingdom in his hands. The local crowds buzzed with anticipation, their murmurs a constant, low hum that did little to disturb his soldiers' patience. He squinted toward the mouth of the river Cydnus, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, a gesture of habit more than threat. As the morning wore on, a ripple of excitement passed through the assembled people, their voices rising in pitch and volume. Antony followed their gaze and saw it. It was not the approach of a single ship, but the arrival of a floating palace. A magnificent barge with a gilded stern and purple sails, the color of royalty, moved against the current as if propelled by some unseen magic, its oars plated in silver and moving in perfect time to the sound of flutes and pipes. The sight was so unexpected, so outrageously bold, that for a moment Antony forgot his purpose. He was a general used to the brutal efficiency of warships, all sharp angles and grim utility. This vessel was a waking dream, a thing of myth sailing into the gritty reality of a provincial Roman port. The barge drew closer, and the details became sharper, each one more unbelievable than the last. A fragrance of countless roses and burning incense drifted across the water, reaching the quay long before the ship itself. It was a scent so powerful it seemed to possess a physical weight, pushing aside the common smells of fish and salt. On the deck, under a canopy woven with gold thread, a woman reclined. She was dressed not as a queen, but as the goddess Venus. Attended by young boys fanned her like cherubs and handmaidens who looked like sea nymphs. Antony felt a strange mix of irritation and awe. This was not the act of a subordinate coming to beg for favor. It was a performance, a deliberate and breathtaking challenge to his authority, staged for the entire city to see.
Hours passed, and the queen made no move to disembark. She did not come to him. Instead, a messenger in Egyptian finery arrived with a scroll sealed with the royal cartouche. The message was simple, yet it upended the entire structure of their meeting. Queen Cleopatra invited Mark Antony, triumvir of Rome, to a banquet aboard her vessel that evening. The crowd, hearing the news ripple through their ranks, erupted in a fresh wave of chatter. Antony found himself smiling, a slow, grudging curl of the lips. He had expected a politician. He was being met by a force of nature. He sent a messenger back with his acceptance, his curiosity now fully ignited. That evening, as he was rowed out to the barge, the spectacle only intensified. The ship was illuminated by so many torches and braziers that their light danced across the river's surface, turning the dark water into a shimmering field of gold. Stepping aboard was like entering another world. The air was warm and perfumed. The floors were covered in thick carpets, and the sounds of laughter and music wrapped around him. He, a man whose idea of a feast was roasted meat and strong wine shared with his legionary commanders, was led to a couch draped in silk. The simple practicality of his Roman life felt 1,000 miles away, a distant memory from a plainer, grayer existence. Cleopatra received him not with deference, but with the easy grace of a hostess welcoming a favored guest. She conversed with him in his own language, her Latin as flawless as her Greek, moving from discussions of military strategy to the poetry of Sappho without missing a beat. Her wit was as sharp and captivating as her beauty, and Antony found himself drawn into her orbit, forgetting he was here to interrogate a subject queen. He had known powerful women in Rome, but they wielded their influence from behind curtains and through whispered suggestions. This woman commanded her world openly, with an intelligence and confidence that was both unsettling and deeply attractive. The food served was a revelation. Dish after dish appeared, each a masterpiece of flavors he had never encountered. There were spices that were both sweet and fiery, fruits that dissolved on the tongue, and wines that tasted of honey and sunlight. He watched as she spoke about the grain shipments from her lands, not as a monarch discussing assets, but as a master merchant who understood the markets, the shipping lanes, and the delicate balance of supply and demand that fed millions. She was not just playing the part of a goddess on a barge. She was the astute mind that kept the entire machinery of her kingdom running, and she was letting him see it. Throughout the long meal, Antony felt the solid foundations of his Roman identity begin to shift. His sense of duty, his political ambition, his recent marriage to the noble Octavia back in Rome, it all seemed like a different life. That world was one of hard lines, rigid traditions, and calculated alliances. It was a world of stone and iron. This world, her world, was one of silk, spice, and dazzling intellect. It was a world of vibrant color and intoxicating possibility. He felt a profound internal conflict brewing, a struggle not just between two women, but between two versions of himself, the Roman general and the man he could be here in the East. He began to wonder if any of it was real. Was her charm a carefully crafted tool of statecraft, designed to disarm and manipulate him? Or was there a genuine warmth behind her quick smile and engaging eyes? He watched her interact with her attendants, a flicker of kindness here, a shared joke there, and found herself unable to decide. The uncertainty was maddening for a man who prided himself on his ability to judge character. He was used to the straightforward loyalties and betrayals of the battlefield, not this complex dance of power and personality. Later, as they stood on the deck, the lights of Tarsus a faint glimmer in the distance, she pointed out the constellations in the night sky. She named them in Greek, then in the ancient Egyptian, telling him the stories her people saw in the stars. Her voice was low and mesmerizing, and for a moment he felt like a boy again, listening to tales of gods and heroes. He had come here to remind her of Rome's power, but instead she was showing him a world far older, richer, and more complex than he had ever imagined. He realized then that the choice he faced was far greater than he had understood. It was not merely a question of political allegiance or personal affection. To embrace her was to embrace the East, to turn his back on the stern, demanding expectations of Rome. To reject her was to return to a life of political maneuvering with Octavian, a life of duty that felt increasingly hollow compared to the vibrant existence she offered. The queen was more than a woman. She was a gateway to a different destiny. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Antony finally returned to the city. The hard stones of the quay felt alien beneath his sandals. The air, now stripped of the barge's perfumes, smelled merely of the sea. He felt the weight of his Roman identity settle back onto his shoulders, but it no longer fit as comfortably as it had before. The world he had known for his entire life suddenly seemed smaller, less brilliant. As the morning grew, he felt the solid ground of his Roman world cracking beneath his feet, replaced by something far more intoxicating and uncertain. The earth beneath Kael's bare feet was a familiar comfort, a coarse and living thing that changed with the seasons. He crumbled a clod of dark, rich soil between his calloused fingers, its dampness a promise. For generations, his family had understood this simple covenant. The river gave, the land produced, and they, its caretakers, survived. It was a rhythm as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun, a cycle of planting and harvest that had sustained them since the time of the first kings. This year, however, a new dissonant note had entered that ancient song. The work was the same, the flood had been good, yet a shadow of scarcity crept over their household, making each measure of grain feel more precious than the last.
This feeling of unease was a quiet visitor in every home along their stretch of the Nile. In the evenings, when the work was done and the families gathered to share their meals of bread and beans, the talk was no longer just of the crops or the neighbors. Instead, the men spoke in low, worried tones about the tax collector's last visit, how he had taken a larger share than ever before. The women, in turn, whispered of how they had to stretch the remaining grain, adding more water to the porridge and baking smaller loaves of bread. Cale's wife, Merit, would look at their young son, her expression a mixture of love and fear, wondering if the stores would last until the next harvest. This new anxiety felt heavier than any sack of grain, a burden carried not on the back, but within the heart. One afternoon, a trader's barge, its sail a splash of worn color against the endless blue of the sky, moored at their village landing. Such arrivals were usually a cause for excitement, a break from the monotony of daily labor, and a chance to hear news from the wider world. The villagers left their fields and workshops, drawn by the prospect of gossip from the great city of Alexandria. The trader, a man with a booming voice and a love for storytelling, did not disappoint. He spoke of incredible spectacles in the city, of parades and feasts that lasted for days. He described a grand ceremony in the public gymnasium where the Roman general, Antony, had sat on a golden throne beside the queen. The crowd listened, their initial curiosity slowly turning to bewilderment. The trader's most fantastic tale was of the donations, as he called the event. He recounted how Antony had proclaimed the queen's children as rulers over lands most of the farmers had never even heard of: Cyprus, Libya, Armenia. He declared Caesarion, the queen's son by the first Roman, to be the true heir and king of kings. The crowd listened, their initial curiosity slowly turning to bewilderment. The trader's most fantastic tale was of the donations, as he called the event. He recounted how Antony had proclaimed the queen's children as rulers over lands most of the farmers had never even heard of: Cyprus, Libya, Armenia. He declared Caesarion, the queen's son by the first Roman, to be the true heir and king of kings. The villagers exchanged confused glances. These were grand words, but they meant little to people whose world was defined by the reach of their own irrigation canals. What did a kingdom across the sea have to do with the price of clay pots in their market? The trader laughed at their simple questions, explaining that this was the way of power, a game of empires played with titles and territories. As the trader continued, a farmer, older than Kael, a man named Sabu, whose face was a map of countless harvests,
voiced the question that was forming in everyone's mind. He asked the trader where the gold for such thrones and the food for such feasts came from. The trader's smile faded slightly. He gestured vaguely toward the fields, toward the endless green expanse that flanked the river. The answer hung unspoken in the space between them. It came from them. Their sweat, their labor, the grain from their lands. It was all being funneled north to the city to pay for these foreign spectacles and to fund armies for a Roman's wars. The connection, once invisible, was now painfully clear. This realization settled over the village like the fine silt left behind by the flood, changing the landscape of their thoughts. The rhythmic chanting of the workers hoisting water from the river with their shadows, a simple bucket and lever system, now sounded different to Kyle. Before, it had been the sound of life, of community and shared effort. Now, it sounded like a lament, the groan of a people laboring to fill a treasury that seemed to have no bottom. Each bucket of water lifted onto the fields felt like a coin being dropped into the Roman general's purse. A quiet, simmering resentment began to take root in the fertile soil of their hearts. A feeling that the mother of Egypt, their divine pharaoh, was spending her children's inheritance on a stranger. The following week, the dread they all felt took shape on the horizon. The tax collector's barge, larger and more ornate than any trader's vessel, appeared as a dark silhouette on the glittering surface of the river. Its approach silenced the village. Workers paused in the fields, mothers gathered their children, and a tense quiet descended. The barge was a vessel of authority, its painted eye of Horus seeming to watch them with a cold, calculating gaze. Kyle stood with the other men of the village, his hands clenched at his sides, feeling the coarse earth beneath his feet no longer as a comfort, but as the very thing being taken from him.
The chief collector, an Egyptian official dressed in fine linen that seemed out of place among their simple work clothes, did not shout or threaten. He did not need to. His authority was absolute, backed by the scribes who recorded every measure of grain and the guards who stood impassively at his side. He unrolled a papyrus scroll and read out the new levies, his voice calm and steady. The amounts were staggering, far more than the year before. A collective murmur of disbelief and despair rippled through the assembled villagers. To give this much would mean a winter of hunger, a season of hardship unlike any they had known. Kyle watched as his neighbors, their shoulders slumped in defeat, began the grim procession to their storage pits. He saw Sabu, the old farmer, hand over a share that left the old man's own family with barely enough to survive. There was no argument, no resistance. To defy the pharaoh's agent was unthinkable. It was to defy the gods themselves. Yet as Kyle added his own sacks to the growing pile on the barge, a seed of doubt sprouted within him. Was this truly the will of the gods, or the will of a queen who had forgotten the source of her kingdom's strength? He felt a profound sense of betrayal, a feeling that the sacred bond between the ruler and the ruled was fraying. After the barge departed, leaving a wake of silent misery, the village felt hollowed out. The evening meal in Kyle's home was a meager affair, eaten in silence. Merit's eyes were shadowed with worry as she portioned out the thin slices of bread. Kael looked at his son, who was too young to understand the gravity of their situation, and felt a surge of protective anger. He had worked this land his entire life, respecting the river, honoring the gods, and paying his dues to the pharaoh. He had always believed that in return, the pharaoh would protect them, that she was the shepherd of her people. But now it felt as if the shepherd was feeding her flock to wolves.
Later that night, Kael walked to the riverbank alone. The water flowed past, indifferent and eternal, its dark surface reflecting the countless stars above. He had always seen the river as a god, a source of life and renewal. It was the heart of their world, the provider of all things. Now he saw it also as a highway, a conduit that carried the wealth of the land away from its people, taking their future with it to a distant city of gold and spectacle. The ancient rhythm of the river that had defined his world now felt both changeless and cruel. The heavy timber of the warship shifted beneath Akil's feet, a constant, living movement that had become as natural as breathing. For weeks, the fleet had waited in the bay, a forest of masts rocking gently in the restless sea. Akil, an Egyptian marine from a village near the delta, ran a thumb over the edge of his spearhead, feeling for any imperfections. He was proud, ready to fight for his queen, the living Isis, who had brought stability and purpose back to the lands of the Nile. Yet, as he looked across the deck, he felt a familiar unease. The Roman legionaries under Antony's command kept to themselves, their faces hard and unreadable, their armor and discipline a stark contrast to the more colorful, boisterous energy of the Egyptian sailors. They were two separate armies on the same ships, a mixture of oil and water that refused to blend. This separation was more than just language or custom. It was a deep and unspoken suspicion. A fellow sailor, a man from Memphis named Kenan, nudged Akil and nodded toward a group of Romans polishing their short swords. "They fight for a man," Kenan murmured, his voice low enough not to carry. "We fight for a goddess." Akil wasn't sure if it was that simple. He had seen the way Antony looked at their queen, a devotion that went beyond politics. He'd also seen the cold calculation in the eyes of Antony's officers, men who saw Egypt as a treasure chest to be used for Roman ambitions. The mistrust was a current running deep beneath the surface, and Akil wondered what would happen when the storm of battle finally broke upon them.
The day of the battle dawned gray and uncertain. There was no grand speech, only the sharp blast of a horn that cut through the morning quiet. The rhythmic creak of hundreds of oars dipping into the water became a single powerful heartbeat driving them forward. Akil's ship was a massive vessel, a quinquereme with 5 banks of oars, and its movement felt slow and ponderous, like a great beast waking from a long sleep. As they cleared the mouth of the bay, the enemy fleet came into view, smaller, more numerous ships under the command of Octavian. They moved with a swiftness that felt predatory.
A nervous energy rippled across the deck, and men began to chant prayers to Amun and Horus, their voices a low hum against the groaning wood and the commands of the ship's captain. Then the world dissolved into a harsh mix of sounds and brutal motion. The first enemy ship closed in, and a volley of arrows hissed through the air. Achille raised his shield, feeling the thud of impacts against the wood and leather. A great stone flung from a catapult smashed into the deck nearby, sending splinters flying like deadly insects. The ship shuddered as grappling hooks bit into its side, and the fight became a desperate, close-quarters struggle. Achilles' spear found its mark, and he pushed forward, his world shrinking to the few feet of planking in front of him. The roar of battle was all-consuming, a torrent of clashing metal, splintering timber, and the raw, guttural cries of men fighting for their lives. His throat burned from shouting and from the stinging smoke that began to drift from a neighboring vessel. For what felt like an eternity, Achille was lost in the brutal rhythm of combat. He parried, thrusted, and shoved, his body moving with the practiced efficiency of a trained soldier. He fought alongside the grim Romans, their short swords a deadly blur, and for a moment, the mistrust was forgotten, replaced by the shared necessity of survival. During a brief pause in the fighting on their section of the ship, as they pushed back a boarding party, Achille scrambled up the rigging for a better view of the unfolding chaos. He needed to see the center of their formation, to find the Queen's flagship, the magnificent Antonia, whose presence was the anchor of their entire fleet. He wiped sweat and grime from his eyes and scanned the horizon, his heart pounding in his chest.
He found it easily. The flagship's great purple sails, a symbol of royalty and power, stood out against the gray sea and sky. But what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The Antonia was not pressing the attack. It was turning. Achille stared, unable to process the sight. Slowly, deliberately, the Queen's vessel broke from the engagement, its sails catching the wind as it headed for the open sea. He watched frozen as Antony's flagship, seeing the maneuver, disengaged from its own fight and followed close behind. The two command ships were leaving the battle. They were running. A single anguished cry rose from a nearby Egyptian sailor who had seen it too. The cry was taken up by others, spreading from ship to ship like a plague. It was a sound of disbelief turning into despair, of hope curdling into betrayal. Achille slid down the rope, his hands raw, his mind reeling. Was this a plan, a strategic retreat he couldn't possibly understand from his lowly position? Or was it something far worse? He looked at the faces of his countrymen, seeing his own confusion and horror reflected back at him. They had been left behind. The anchor of their fleet was gone, and they were adrift in a sea of enemies. The shift in morale was immediate and devastating. The fighting spirit that had burned so brightly just moments before seemed to flicker and die. The disciplined Roman legionaries on his ship fought on, their faces set like stone. But the Egyptians faltered. Their movements became hesitant, their shouts losing their confident edge.
Orders from the officers were ignored or met with panicked stares. The cohesive line of battle began to crumble as individual ships, now without direction, tried to fend for themselves. Octavian's smaller, more agile vessels swarmed them, exploiting the confusion with brutal efficiency. Achilles saw a nearby Egyptian ship, its crew overwhelmed, consumed by flames as the enemy closed in. His own ship was soon surrounded. A fire had broken out near the stern, and the smoke was a choking blanket that made every breath a painful effort. The deck grew slick with water from the buckets and something far thicker. The violent, stomach-churning roll of the ship intensified as it took on more damage. Great groans coming from its timbers, as if the vessel itself was dying. Achilles found himself fighting not for victory, but for a few more moments of life. The unity of purpose was gone, replaced by a desperate individual struggle to survive the coming darkness. He no longer knew who he was fighting for. The battle ended not with a final, decisive clash, but with a slow, grinding collapse. One by one, the great ships of Antony and Cleopatra's fleet were captured or destroyed. Achilles' vessel, battered and burning, was eventually grappled by 2 enemy ships. The remaining defenders, exhausted and leaderless, were overwhelmed. Achilles took a heavy blow to the side of his head and fell, the chaos around him fading into a muffled roar. The last thing he saw before consciousness left him was the enemy standard, a golden eagle, being raised on the mast of his own ship. The world had not just been lost, it had been given away. He woke to the gentle rocking of a ship at anchor and the sting of brine on a cut above his eye. He was a prisoner, his hands bound. All around him were the other survivors, a silent, hollow-eyed collection of men who had been part of the proudest fleet on the Great Sea only a day before. The sounds of battle were gone, replaced by the quiet lapping of waves and the distant cries of gulls. The air was still hazy, and the water was littered with the debris of their defeat. Shattered planks, broken oars, and the dark, silent shapes of things he did not want to identify. He had no idea where they were or what would become of them. A Roman guard offered him a cup of water, and Achilles drank, the cool liquid a small relief in the vastness of his misery. The Roman said nothing, his expression not of triumph, but of weariness. Achilles thought of his queen, of her turning sails, and the question burned in his mind once more. Had she saved herself to fight another day, believing the battle was already lost? Or had she simply abandoned them all? He had no answers, only the bitter taste of defeat and the profound, aching certainty that everything he had fought for was gone. The 2 currents that had flowed together down the Nile, one Egyptian, one Roman, had finally met a storm at sea, and only one had survived. In the smoky twilight of the captured bay, Achilles carried the heavy weight of a lost world as the remaining ships drifted in silence. The sea, which had once promised glory and a future for his kingdom, had delivered only broken oars and the end of an age. He closed his eyes, not against the stinging smoke, but against the image of those purple sails, beautiful and terrible, disappearing over the horizon,
leaving him and thousands of others to their fate. The city of Alexandria, once the jewel of the world, had fallen quiet. From within the thick stone walls of the mausoleum, the familiar sounds of the streets were gone, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Charmian, the queen's most devoted handmaiden, felt the silence not in her ears, but as a pressure against her skin, a heavy blanket that smothered every echo. The air inside was cool, carrying the scent of cut stone and drying plaster, a stark contrast to the life that had once filled every palace corridor. Outside, she knew, Roman patrols marched with the steady, disciplined tread that had conquered the world. Here, inside this monument to a future that would never arrive, there was only waiting. It was a new kind of existence, this life measured in the silent passing of shadows across the marble floor.
This profound quiet was broken only by the muffled sounds of Cleopatra's grief for Antony. She had mourned him with a passion that seemed to crack the very stones around them, a storm of sorrow for the man who had been her partner in ruling half the world. Charmian tended to her, bringing cool water and soft linens, watching as the queen's frame shook with each wave of loss. Yet, as the days turned, Charmian saw something else emerge from beneath the pain. A stillness began to settle in her queen's eyes, a focused calm that was more formidable than any army. The grief was real, a wound that would never heal, but beneath it was a core of unbending iron, a resolve that had been forged in a lifetime of ruling a kingdom caught between great powers. That resolve was tested when the first of Octavian's messengers arrived. He was a Roman of some standing, confident and direct, speaking of terms and the future of Egypt. Charmian stood behind her queen, a silent observer to a negotiation that was not about surrender, but about legacies. Cleopatra did not beg for her own life. She never mentioned it. Instead, her voice was clear and firm as she spoke of her children, of Caesarion's claim as Caesar's true son, and of securing their futures as rulers of kingdoms Antony had promised them. The Roman listened politely, his face an unreadable mask, but he made no promises. Charmian understood then that they were not negotiating with a man, but with an empire that saw Egypt as nothing more than a prize to be claimed. After the messenger departed, a new understanding settled in the room. The hope for her children's reign was a fragile thing, perhaps already broken. Cleopatra walked to a high, narrow window, looking out over her captured city. She did not speak for a long time, and Charmian watched the straight, proud line of her back. The queen was calculating, weighing options that grew fewer with each passing hour. She had used her wit, her wealth, and her will to hold back the tide for 20 years, playing a game against men who commanded legions with a flick of a wrist. Now the game was over, and only the final move remained. Charmian wondered what it felt like to hold the weight of 300 years of pharaohs on your shoulders, only to be the one who sees it end. Another messenger came, his words smoother, but his message colder. He spoke of Octavian's generosity, of the great honor that awaited her. He described the triumph that would be held in Rome, a grand parade to celebrate the victory. He painted a picture of the Roman people marveling at the exotic queen from the Nile. Charmian felt a chill run down her spine, a coldness that had nothing to do with the stone tomb. She saw the image he was trying to hide behind his polite words. Her queen, the living goddess Isis, dragged through the dusty streets of Rome in golden chains, a spectacle for a foreign mob. It was not an offer of life. It was an offer of the ultimate humiliation, a public destruction of her majesty and her legacy. When he was gone, Cleopatra turned to Charmian, and the last flicker of uncertainty was gone from her eyes. In its place was a luminous clarity, a decision made. There would be no chains. There would be no parade. The last queen of Egypt would not be a Roman trophy. She would meet her end on her own terms, in her own land, as a pharaoh. "It is time," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "Help me prepare. I must look the part." It was not a request born of vanity, but of duty. She was preparing for her final, most important public appearance, an audience with eternity itself. Together, she and her other loyal handmaiden, Iris, began the careful, deliberate process of dressing their queen. They brought out the finest linen robes, white as the lotus flower, and the intricate golden collar, heavy with lapis lazuli and carnelian. Every piece of jewelry, every sacred symbol, was placed with ritualistic care. This was not a woman dressing for a banquet, but a high priestess preparing for the most sacred of rites. Charmian's hands were steady as she worked, her movements practiced and sure. She was not merely an attendant. She was a participant in an act that would echo through history, a final gesture of defiance against the most powerful man in the world.
As Charmian placed the royal diadem upon her mistress's head, she felt the cool, smooth weight of the gold and the polished stones. The uraeus, the rearing cobra that symbolized divine authority, rested on the queen's brow, ready to strike. Cleopatra looked not at her reflection, but through it, as if she could already see the shores of the afterlife. She was no longer just a woman who had loved and lost, but the physical form of Egypt itself, the incarnation of Isis, mother of all. There was no fear in her face, only a profound and regal peace, the calm of a mariner who has navigated a long and treacherous sea and now sees the final harbor. A guard brought a small basket, sent from a loyal farmer in the countryside. He complained about the thoroughness of the Roman soldiers at the gate, who had inspected everything else, but had waved this simple offering of figs through. When the basket was opened, the faint, sweet scent of the ripe fruit rose into the air. Beneath the top layer of figs, nestled among the leaves, was the asp. It was small, a creature of the Nile, a sacred instrument of passage. There was no grand speech, no final proclamation. Cleopatra simply reached into the basket, her movements graceful and unhurried. She lay down upon her golden couch, her royal robes arranged perfectly around her. Eros, ever loyal, collapsed at her feet, having found her own secret way to follow her queen. Charmian remained standing, watching over her mistress as the poison did its swift, silent work. She saw the queen's final breath, a gentle sigh that was not of pain, but of release.
For a moment, she stood in the echoing silence of the tomb, alone with two queens, one of Egypt, one of devotion. She saw that in the last moments, the royal diadem had shifted slightly, resting crookedly upon the queen's brow. The sound of shouting and splintering wood at the doors broke the stillness. Roman soldiers burst into the chamber, their swords drawn, their faces a mixture of urgency and awe at the scene before them. The commanding officer rushed forward, seeing the lifeless form on the couch. "Was this rightly done?" he demanded, his voice rough with frustration and shock, his victory soured. Charmian, feeling a growing coldness spread through her own limbs from a poison she had taken herself, moved with her last ounce of strength. She reached out and gently adjusted the crown on her mistress's head, making it straight and true. "It was rightly done," she whispered, her voice fading. "For such a queen, descended from so many kings." Her final duty to her queen was complete, and as her vision blurred, the stone chamber seemed to fade into a peaceful darkness. Tomorrow would bring no more demands. And so, our journey through the brilliant, turbulent life of Cleopatra finds its quiet conclusion. Her story was not just her own. It was the final, resonant chord of the entire Ptolemaic Dynasty, a Greek Macedonian family that ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. With her passing, the great ambitions, the political storms, and the immense weight of a divine crown were finally laid to rest. An era did not just end. It found its ultimate silent peace after generations of conflict and splendor. As the story of the last Ptolemaic queen settles into the quiet of the past, let that same sense of peaceful finality settle over you. The long day is done. The narrative is complete. May you drift into slumber, carried by the gentle current of history, and may your rest be as deep and untroubled as the long silence that followed a dynasty's end. Sleep well.